Use assessment. Use assessment to help your students connect God's world and God's Word. I'm Michael Essenburg of Close the Gap Now, and I want to share with you 5 things you can do to move forward on using assessment to help your students connect God's world and God's Word. First, you can analyze how assessment helps. You can analyze how assessment helps your students connect God's world and God's Word. If you give an assessment that requires your students to make connections, your students will make connections and they'll get practice in making connections. Assessment will actually help your kids move forward on connecting God's world and God's Word. Second, you can identify the types of assessment you want to use. Now, this might depend on the class you're in. You might want to give a project or maybe a presentation or maybe an essay. So think about and identify the types of assessment you want to use. Third, you can develop assessments that require your students to make connections. You can develop assessments that require your students to connect God's world and God's Word. Fourth, you can prepare your students for the assessments that you've developed. You can actually teach to the assessment prompt. You can teach them to connect God's world and God's Word so that when they get to the assessment, they can do it. And finally, fifth, you can use the assessment data you've got to modify subsequent instruction. You can look at the connections that kids made, think about what they're doing, and then decide what action steps you want to take next. I want to encourage you to use assessment. To use assessment to help your students connect God's world and God's Word. 5 things you can do are analyze how assessment helps, identify the types of assessment you want to use, develop assessments that require connections, prepare your students for the assessment, and use your assessment data to modify instruction.